The Blood Oath Part 2. Chapter 18, Awakening the Storm. Selene stood at the edge of the ruined battlefield, her mind a storm of doubts and revelations. The wind howled through the shattered remnants of the once great fortress, whispering secrets only she could hear. The blood of the firstborn flowed through her veins, a lineage more ancient than even the vampire lords who sought to control her. But what did it truly mean? Lucian watched her, his golden spear now dimmed, yet his presence remained unwavering. "You feel it, don't you?" he said. "The power waking inside you." Selene met his gaze, her hands trembling. She had always felt different, stronger than the others, but she had never questioned it, until now. The Forsaken feared her, not for what she was, but for what she could become. "I don't understand it," she admitted. "How do I unlock it?" Lucian stepped forward, drawing a symbol in the air with his fingertips. The runes flared to life, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally. "The celestial blood within you is bound, sealed long ago to keep you from reaching your full potential." His amber eyes darkened. "If we are to stand a chance against the Forsaken, you must break that seal." Kael stepped between them, his stance protective. "And what happens when she does? If her power is so dangerous, what's stopping it from consuming her?" Lucian hesitated. "That is a risk we must take." Selene clenched her fists. "Then show me." Lucian nodded solemnly and raised his spear. The golden tip pulsed, and as he brought it down, the earth beneath them trembled. The air crackled with energy, and Selene felt something shift inside her, a barrier unraveling, a storm gathering beneath her skin. Pain erupted through her body, searing, unrelenting. She gasped, falling to her knees as images flooded her mind, visions of a past she had never lived, memories not her own. A woman cloaked in celestial light, standing atop a battlefield drenched in blood. A king's betrayal. A child taken before its destiny could be fulfilled. And then, the darkness. A monstrous entity with eyes like twin voids whispering her name. Selene screamed as the power surged through her, burning away the restraints that had bound her all her life. Her veins pulsed with light, and the sky above them cracked open, revealing a glimpse of something beyond mortal comprehension. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, and Kael rushed forward, catching her before she could collapse completely. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The voices had stopped, but the knowledge they had left behind remained. She looked up at Lucian, realization dawning in her eyes. "I know what they want. I know why they fear me." Lucian's expression was grim. "Then you also know that they will come for you, stronger than before." Kael tightened his hold on her. "Then we'll be ready." Selene's eyes, now glowing with a fierce golden light, met Kael's. "No," she whispered. "They'll never be ready for me." Expansion on Selene's source of power. Selene's power was not merely inherited, it was an ancient force woven into the very fabric of existence. She was a descendant of the celestial bloodline, a forgotten lineage of beings who once acted as mediators between the realms of darkness and light. Their power was drawn from the celestial stars themselves, a force older than the world, channeled through their very essence. Long ago, fearing the power she might wield, the vampire lords conspired with the Forsaken to suppress her true nature. A blood seal was placed upon her soul, binding her celestial energy and preventing her from fully realizing her potential. But as Lucian had revealed, that seal was weakening. Her awakening had begun the moment she had defied her father and saved Kael. It had strengthened when she fought against the Forsaken, and now, as the remnants of the celestial energy flared within her, she knew there was no turning back. She was more than just a vampire princess, she was the heir to a power neither realm had dared to face in centuries. The Forsaken feared her because she was the only one who could undo their dark reign. But what unsettled her the most was the knowledge that came with her awakening. The void-born entity in her visions, the voice calling her name, was not just a threat. It was waiting for her. Chapter 19, The Gathering Darkness. The air was thick with tension as Selene stood at the edge of the ruined battlefield, her newfound power still crackling beneath her skin. The golden glow in her eyes had dimmed, but the knowledge she had gained lingered like a shadow in her mind. The Forsaken would come for her, but she was no longer the frightened princess hiding behind duty and bloodlines. She was something else now, something greater, something feared. Kael watched her carefully, his grip on his blade tightening. "Are you all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Selene turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I know what we have to do," she said. "But it won't be easy." Lucian stepped forward, his gaze wary. "You saw it, didn't you? The thing lurking in the void." She nodded, shivers running down her spine as she recalled the creature's hollow gaze. "It's not just waiting for me," she whispered. "It's been watching all of us. Manipulating from the shadows." Kael exchanged a glance with Lucian. "Then we need to strike before it does." Before another word could be spoken, a deafening roar echoed through the desolate land. The three warriors spun toward the source of the sound, their instincts sharp. In the distance, beyond the ruined towers and broken lands, a figure emerged, a silhouette against the blood-red sky. It was a Forsaken general. Tall and armored in shadows, his presence alone seemed to warp reality. His voice slithered through the air like a poisoned whisper. "Selene," he called, his tone laced with something ancient and cruel. "You have awakened, just as we feared." Selene took a step forward, unfazed. "Then you should also fear what comes next." The general chuckled, a sound devoid of mirth. "Brave words. But you are still learning, still incomplete. You are nothing compared to what awaits in the void." Kael moved to stand beside her. "She's more than enough to end you." The general's grin widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too unnatural. "We shall see." With a wave of his hand, the ground beneath them trembled, and from the cracks, monstrous beings began to rise, forsaken creatures, twisted and enraged, their hollow eyes set upon Selene and her companions. Lucian readied his spear, Kael bared his fangs, and Selene, her power thrumming, raised her hands. Golden energy swirled at her fingertips as she prepared for the fight of her life. The battle had only just begun. Chapter 20, Clash of Fate. The Forsaken general raised his hand, and the sky darkened further, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from his presence. Shadows stretched unnaturally, congealing into monstrous forms that lunged towards Selene, Kael, and Lucian. The battle erupted in an instant, a maelstrom of fangs, claws, and magic. Selene moved like a tempest, golden energy crackling around her as she lashed out with her power. Every strike sent Forsaken creatures shrieking into oblivion, their twisted forms disintegrating under the force of celestial magic. Her eyes glowed like twin suns, her newfound strength surging with every moment of combat. Kael fought with primal ferocity, his claws tearing through his foes with devastating precision. He twisted through the battlefield, his form a blur of muscle and fury. When a massive, hulking Forsaken beast lunged at him, he met its charge head-on, sinking his fangs deep into its throat. The creature let out a guttural shriek before crumbling into dust. Lucian danced through the chaos with deadly grace, his spear a blur of silver and shadows. He moved like a spectre, his strikes precise and merciless, each one piercing the Forsaken where they were weakest. One creature lashed out at him with barbed tendrils, but Lucian spun low, severing its limbs before plunging his weapon through its heart. The Forsaken general watched from afar, his expression unreadable. Impressive, he mused. But futile. With a flick of his wrist, a black, jagged spear materialized in his hand. He hurled it towards Selene with terrifying speed. She barely had time to react. Kael tackled her aside, the spear grazing his shoulder as it embedded itself into the ground. Dark energy exploded outward, warping the earth where it struck. Selene's heart pounded. She had barely sensed the attack in time. The general wasn't just a warrior, he was something else entirely, something ancient. Something far worse than she had imagined. Kael grimaced, gripping his wounded arm. "We can't let him control the battlefield." Lucian nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We take him together." The three warriors surged forward, each attacking from different angles. Selene unleashed a barrage of golden energy, forcing the general to summon a shield of writhing darkness. Kael struck at his flank, but the general countered with unnatural speed, deflecting the werewolf's claws with his own shadow-forged blade. Lucian feinted, then drove his spear forward, but the general twisted impossibly fast, parrying and delivering a bone-shattering kick to Lucian's chest, sending him crashing into a nearby ruin. Selene's fury ignited. She summoned a storm of radiant fire, hurling it directly at the general. The flames exploded upon impact, engulfing him in a brilliant inferno. For a moment, silence fell over the battlefield. Then, from within the blaze, a deep, mocking laugh rang out. The flames parted, revealing the general, unharmed. His armor had absorbed the attack, drinking in the light like a bottomless abyss. "You still do not understand, child," he said, stepping forward. "Your power is vast, yes. But it is unrefined. You cannot hope to defeat what you do not comprehend." Selene's hands clenched into fists. She could feel her strength waning, the battle taking its toll. The Forsaken were unrelenting, their numbers seemingly endless. And their leader? He was toying with them. But something stirred within her. A whisper in her blood, an echo of the celestial lineage she had only begun to understand. The light within her was deeper than mere energy, it was knowledge, boundless and ancient. She closed her eyes, inhaling. The battlefield, the chaos, the fear, it all faded. Instead, she reached within herself, past the pain, past the exhaustion, into the very core of what she was. When she opened her eyes again, they blazed with a brilliance unlike before. The general hesitated, for the first time. And then, Selene struck. Chapter 21, Embrace of the Light. A storm raged within Selene. The battlefield blurred around her, the clash of weapons, the cries of the wounded, the flickering of fire and shadow. But she was trapped within her own mind, caught between two selves, the princess who had been raised in darkness and the warrior who had glimpsed the light. Doubt clawed at her. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if the power inside her was just a flicker, a false hope? The Forsaken general had withstood her strongest attacks as if they were nothing. How could she possibly defeat something so ancient, so monstrous? Her breath came fast and ragged. Her fingers trembled. The light that had surged within her moments ago felt fragile now, slipping from her grasp like sand through her fingers. "Selene." Kael's voice cut through the haze, raw with desperation. He was still fighting, still pushing forward despite his wounds. He believed in her. Lucian, bloodied but unbroken, cast her a glance filled with something unexpected, trust. He had doubted her once. But not now. Selene's hands clenched. No. She would not falter. The general stepped closer, his armored form radiating a chilling darkness that seemed to snuff out the very air. "Do you feel it, child?" His voice was low, hypnotic. "The weight of your own fear? It is your greatest weakness. Your power is wasted on you." He was wrong. Selene took a deep breath. She reached inward, past the fear, past the uncertainty, to the spark that had always been there. It wasn't just magic. It was something far older. The truth whispered in her blood, in the lineage she had denied for so long. She was not merely a vampire. She was something more. The moment she embraced it, a rush of energy flooded through her veins, burning away the last vestiges of doubt. Her golden light flared, brighter than before, but it was no longer wild and uncontrolled. It was steady, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. The Forsaken General took an instinctive step back. Selene lifted her gaze, her eyes glowing like twin stars. She extended her hand, and the light obeyed her command, swirling and forming a blade of pure celestial fire. "You fear my power," she said, her voice steady. "Because you know it was meant to end you." The general snarled, his confidence flickering. "Then strike me down, if you dare." Selene's grip tightened on the radiant blade. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt no fear. She was ready. And she would not fail. Chapter 22, The Unbreakable Will. The moment Selene took a step forward, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The golden fire of her celestial blade flickered in the air, casting an ethereal glow on the blood-soaked ground. The Forsaken General, who had once stood unshaken, now narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in power. Selene could feel it, too. The fear that had once gripped her had been burned away by something deeper, something primal and ancient. Strength coursed through her veins, but it was more than magic, it was purpose. She was no longer bound by the shadows of doubt. With a cry that echoed like a war song, she lunged. Her blade met the general's dark sword in a clash that sent a shockwave across the battlefield. The impact of their battle sent soldiers, both vampire and werewolf, staggering backward. The general countered, his strikes as swift as death itself, but Selene met each one with unyielding resolve. Sparks erupted as their weapons clashed, light against shadow, hope against despair. She no longer fought only for survival, she fought for Kael, for Lucian, for every soul that had suffered under the tyranny of war. The battle raged around them, but Selene and the general were locked in their own deadly dance. He swung his blade in a dark arc, and she barely dodged, feeling the rush of cold air as it passed inches from her. With a twist of her wrist, she struck back, her blade slicing into his shoulder. The general growled in pain, but his eyes gleamed with something sinister. "You think you have won?" he sneered, blood dripping from his wound. "This war does not end with my defeat." Selene held her blade steady, her chest heaving. "No," she said, her voice steady. "But it begins with your fall." The general snarled and lunged, but this time, Selene was faster. She sidestepped and drove her glowing blade deep into his chest. A terrible scream ripped from his throat as the celestial fire consumed him, his body writhing in agony as the darkness was purged from his form. As he crumbled into ash, silence fell over the battlefield. The Forsaken forces, witnessing their leader's demise, hesitated, fear and uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Kael, battered but still standing, stepped forward. "Stand down," he commanded. "The tide has turned. This war does not have to end in more bloodshed." A murmur rippled through the enemy ranks. Without their general, without the overwhelming presence of his dark power, they were vulnerable. Selene turned to Lucian, who was watching her with something close to awe. "We can end this," she said. "But we must do it together." Lucian met her gaze, and after a tense moment, he nodded. "Then let's finish what we started." As the night sky loomed above them, Selene knew the battle was won, but the war for their future had only just begun. Chapter 23, Echoes of War. The battlefield lay in eerie silence, the embers of destruction still smoldering in the cold night air. The bodies of the fallen, vampire, werewolf, and Forsaken alike, painted a grim testament to the night's carnage. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a fragile sense of hope lingered. Selene stood at the heart of it all, her celestial blade still flickering with the remnants of divine fire. The power inside her had not faded, but rather, it had settled, an ember instead of an inferno, waiting to be called upon again. Lucian approached, his armor dented and smeared with the blood of enemies and allies alike. "They've begun retreating," he said, motioning to the remnants of the Forsaken army dissolving into the darkness. "They fear what you've become." Kael, still recovering from his wounds, watched her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You changed the tide of this war," he murmured. "But at what cost?" Selene clenched her fists. She had embraced her power, but it had come with a terrible burden. The celestial magic had felt intoxicating, yet beneath its radiance lurked a whisper of something ancient, something watching. A rustle from the shadows broke her thoughts. A lone Forsaken warrior staggered forward, his once glowing eyes now dull with exhaustion. Instead of attacking, he fell to his knees. "The war is over," he rasped. "But something worse is coming." Selene's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The warrior lifted his gaze to hers, fear etched deep into his face. "The prophecy, it wasn't about this war. It was about what comes after." A chill swept through Selene's spine. She turned to Kael, then Lucian. The war they had fought had been brutal, but had it only been the prelude to something greater? Far beyond the battlefield, deep in the shadows of the mountains, an ancient force stirred. And Selene knew, with every fiber of her being, that their fight was far from over. Chapter 24, A Moment of Serenity. The air was still, a rare peace settling over the war-torn landscape. The fires of battle had long since died down, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Selene and Kael found themselves alone beneath the vast night sky. The moon hung low, casting a soft silver glow over the land, illuminating the quiet sanctuary they had found, a hidden glade nestled between ancient ruins, untouched by war. Selene let out a slow breath, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of her armor, still marred with the blood of their enemies. The weight of battle clung to her, but here, with Kael standing beside her, it felt lighter. She turned to him, her violet eyes searching his face, taking in the way the moonlight softened his rugged features. Kael watched her in silence for a moment before stepping closer. "You shouldn't bear all of this alone," he murmured, his voice rough yet filled with warmth. She looked away, her hands clenching into fists. "I had to embrace the power, there was no other way." Kael reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "And you did. But that power doesn't change who you are." He brushed his fingers along her palm, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You're still Selene, the woman who fights not out of vengeance, but out of love." A lump formed in her throat. He saw her, beyond the magic, beyond the war. "And you? You nearly died today," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't lose you, Kael." His hands found her face, tilting it up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You won't." "I swear it." She didn't know who moved first, but the next thing she knew, his lips were on hers, firm, warm, filled with unspoken promises. The world around them faded, the war, the prophecy, the looming threats, all of it vanished as she melted into him. For a fleeting moment, there was no vampire, no werewolf, no battle to fight. There was only them. As they pulled apart, breathless, Kael pressed his forehead against hers. "No matter what comes next, we face it together." Selene nodded, her heart steady for the first time in a long time. Together. And for this single night, beneath the quiet watch of the stars, they allowed themselves to believe in a future beyond war, beyond prophecy, a future where love could defy fate itself. Chapter 25, The Gathering Storm. Dawn was breaking, casting golden light over the ruins where Selene and Kael had shared a fleeting moment of peace. But peace was always an illusion, and the war was never far behind. A sharp wind carried the scent of blood, a grim reminder that their enemies would not rest. Selene stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Something was coming, she could feel it, a dark pulse in the air, a whisper in her bones. Kael joined her, his presence grounding. "You sense it too," he murmured. She nodded. "Something powerful. Something ancient." Before he could respond, the earth trembled beneath them. Distant howls echoed through the valley, followed by the guttural cries of creatures that did not belong to the living. Shadows slithered from the trees, unnatural and writhing, their presence filling the air with an icy dread. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, imposing figure draped in a midnight cloak, his face obscured by a mask of bone. His very aura reeked of death and forgotten magic. "I was beginning to think you would never awaken, Selene," the figure spoke, his voice smooth yet laced with menace. "You hold power you do not yet comprehend. But you will." Selene's grip tightened around the hilt of her blade. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, his presence suffocating. "I am Malachar, the keeper of the forgotten. And I have come for what is mine." A surge of dark energy erupted from his hands, tendrils of shadow striking toward her. Kael reacted instantly, pulling her back as the attack shattered the ground where she had stood. Selene's heart pounded. This was no ordinary enemy. Malachar was something far worse, something born from the deepest abyss of time itself. And if he had come for her, then the true war had only just begun. Chapter 26, Malachar's Legacy. The air grew heavier as Malachar's shadowed form loomed over Selene and Kael. His presence was oppressive, ancient, carrying the weight of something that had slumbered for far too long. The mere utterance of his name sent a chill down Selene's spine. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" Malachar's voice was almost amused, yet beneath it lay a terrible wrath. "Then let me enlighten you before I take back what is rightfully mine." Selene tightened her grip on her blade, her heart pounding. "Tell me, then. What is it that you want from me?" Malachar's midnight cloak billowed as he took a step forward. The shadows twisted around him, coiling like living serpents. "I was not always the keeper of the forgotten. I was once like you, a ruler, a warrior, a child of power. But power is a cruel master." He extended a pale hand, and suddenly, the world around them shifted. The battlefield melted away, replaced by a vision. A great city stood before them, towering spires of black stone piercing a crimson sky. Banners of an unknown sigil fluttered in an unnatural wind. The streets were filled with creatures both human and monstrous, their eyes hollow, their expressions void of will. In the center of it all stood a throne carved from obsidian, and upon it sat a man who bore Malachar's face, but younger, regal, untouched by darkness. "I was once the High Lord of Nyxvaris, the lost kingdom of the night," Malachar's voice echoed through the illusion. "I ruled over an empire of strength, feared yet revered. The balance of power rested in my hands, until I made a grave mistake." The vision darkened. The sky above the city cracked open, revealing an abyss of swirling shadows. From its depths, something monstrous descended, a being of pure void, its essence like an eternal eclipse. The younger Malachar stood before it, arms outstretched, his voice ringing in desperate invocation. "I sought knowledge beyond the limits of mortal understanding. I thought I could command the abyss, that I could bend it to my will. But the abyss does not serve, it devours." A horrid scream echoed through the vision as the monstrous void being consumed the city in black flames. People crumbled into dust, their souls ripped from their bodies. The throne of Nyxvaris shattered, its power turned to ruin. "And so," Malachar continued, his voice colder than the grave, "I was cast into the void, neither dead nor alive, cursed to become its herald. I became its keeper, the one who ensures that no mortal dares to wield what I once did. Until now." The illusion faded, and Selene found herself staring into Malachar's abyssal eyes. "You hold the blood of the ancients, Selene. The power within you is what I once sought, a power that must never be unleashed. Her breath caught in her throat. Then why come for me? Malakar's lips curled into a grim smile. Because, my dear princess, you are the key to either sealing the abyss forever or opening it anew. And I will not allow history to repeat itself. Without warning, Malakar lunged, his shadows reaching for her like claws of the void itself. The battle for fate had begun. Chapter 27, The Abyss Beckons. Selene barely had time to react before Malakar's shadows lunged at her. They weren't like any darkness she had encountered before, these were alive, writhing tendrils of nothingness that swallowed even the light of the stars. She twisted, narrowly avoiding their grasp, but the cold they left in their wake burned worse than fire. Kael roared, his body shifting mid-air as he slashed at the shadows with his claws. His strike severed the tendrils, but they reformed almost instantly, slithering back to Malakar like extensions of his own being. You fight well, Malakar said, almost admiringly. But I am not here to destroy you. Not yet. He flicked his wrist, and a great force slammed into Kael, sending him flying across the battlefield. Selene's heart clenched as she watched Kael crash against the stone ruins, but he was already pushing himself up, bloodied but defiant. Malakar's gaze returned to Selene. You have power unlike any I have seen. But do you truly understand what you wield? Selene clenched her fists, the energy within her thrumming, desperate to be released. I know enough to stand against you. A dark chuckle escaped Malakar's lips. Then let me show you what you do not know. The ground beneath them trembled as the air warped, the battlefield dissolving into a vast, endless void. The stars overhead dimmed, consumed by a churning abyss that stretched in all directions. Selene felt her breath hitch. This was no mere illusion, this was the abyss Malakar had spoken of. The place that had devoured his kingdom. This is the fate of unchecked power, Malakar said, his voice echoing as though coming from all directions. The abyss does not destroy. It absorbs. It takes and takes until nothing remains but the echoes of those who once defied it. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, distorted figures with hollow eyes, voices whispering, calling her name. Selene shivered as she realized what they were. Lost souls. The remnants of Nyxvaris. A flicker of fear twisted in her chest. Was this the fate that awaited her if she lost control? Your blood is bound to this place, Selene, Malakar continued, stepping closer. It calls to you. Do you not hear it? Selene squeezed her eyes shut. At first, there was nothing but the whispers. But then, beneath them, she heard something deeper, something that resonated inside her very core. A heartbeat. Slow, steady, ancient. When she opened her eyes again, the abyss seemed different. No longer just an endless void, but something alive. And within it, something waited. I know what you're trying to do, Selene whispered. You want me to fear this power. You want me to believe I have no choice but to surrender to it. Malakar tilted his head, watching her with something almost akin to curiosity. And do you? Selene's hands clenched at her sides. For so long, she had fought against the idea that she was bound to something greater than herself. That she was nothing more than a pawn in a prophecy written long before her birth. But now, staring into the abyss, she saw the truth. She wasn't meant to be consumed by the abyss. She was meant to master it. Selene took a step forward, and the void shifted. The whispers grew louder, but she did not waver. The heartbeat within her strengthened, pulsing in time with her own. The darkness no longer clawed at her, it coiled around her, waiting. Malakar's expression darkened. You think you can control it? Selene met his gaze, her voice steady. I know I can. A silence stretched between them, tense and unyielding. Then Malakar's lips curved into something resembling a smile. Then prove it. With a flick of his wrist, the abyss roared to life, its shadows twisting into monstrous forms. The final trial had begun. Chapter 28, The Abyss Unleashed. Selene barely had time to take another breath before Malakar struck. The abyss around them twisted violently, black tendrils whipping through the air like storm-driven waves. With a flick of his wrist, Malakar commanded the darkness to converge upon her. Selene raised her hands, summoning her own power. A pulse of silver light erupted from her, colliding with the inky blackness. The two forces clashed, creating a shockwave that sent both combatants sliding backward. "You are powerful," Malakar admitted, his voice eerily calm as he stepped forward, darkness swirling around his feet. "But you still fight like a mortal, clinging to the limits of flesh and fear." Selene gritted her teeth. "And you fight like a coward, hiding behind shadows." With a cry, she thrust her hands forward, unleashing a torrent of luminous energy. The ground beneath them cracked as the force of her magic tore through the abyss, carving a path of light. But Malakar merely smiled. He gestured with both hands, and the abyss itself moved to consume her attack, swallowing her light whole. Selene gasped as the darkness retaliated, rushing toward her like a living tide. She spun, evading the worst of it, but tendrils of shadow lashed at her arms and legs, dragging her down. The cold burned, seeping into her very bones. Kael's roar split the air. "Selene!" A golden blur shot across the battlefield, Kael, his eyes blazing like molten amber. He struck with claws bared, tearing through the shadowy restraints that bound Selene. She gasped as the cold released her, stumbling back into Kael's waiting arms. "I won't let him take you," he growled. Selene's gaze met his, gratitude flashing in her violet eyes, but she knew this was her battle to fight. "I have to finish this, Kael." Kael nodded grimly. "Then do it. And make him regret ever underestimating you." She turned back to Malakar, determination hardening her features. "You claim I do not understand my power," she said. "Then let me show you what I've learned." The abyss roiled around them, but Selene no longer feared it. She let it in, not as an enemy, but as something she could wield. The whispers that had once sought to consume her now spoke with clarity, and the heartbeat she had felt before thrummed stronger than ever. Malakar's smirk faltered. "What are you doing?" Selene's form began to glow, a fusion of darkness and light radiating from her core. Her silver energy no longer fought against the abyss, it danced with it. A luminous storm built around her, tendrils of light entwining with shadow, creating something new. Malakar's eyes widened. "Impossible." Selene lifted her hands, her voice a whisper laced with power. "Not impossible. Destiny." With a single motion, she released everything. A surge of magic exploded outward, blinding in its brilliance. The abyss screamed as Selene's energy surged through it, purging the corruption Malakar had wielded for so long. The battlefield trembled as the force shattered Malakar's hold over the abyss itself. Malakar let out a furious cry, shadows writhing around him. But the darkness no longer obeyed him. It recoiled, retreating from Selene's light. Selene stepped forward, energy crackling around her. "This ends now." She raised her hands for the final blow. Malakar snarled, gathering the last of his strength for one desperate attack. But as he lunged, Selene struck. Light and shadow collided one last time, and Malakar's scream echoed through the void. His form wavered, darkness peeling away as his power unraveled. Then, with one final burst of radiance, he was gone. The abyss stilled. The shadows retreated. And for the first time in centuries, silence reigned. Selene staggered, the weight of her victory pressing upon her. Kael was at her side in an instant, catching her before she could fall. You did it, he murmured, awe in his voice. Selene let out a shuddering breath, staring at the now quiet battlefield. It's over. But deep within the lingering shadows, something stirred. Something ancient. Something watching. And Selene knew their battle was far from finished. Chapter 29, The Shadow's Warning. The silence in the abyss was unnatural, stretching out like a wound in reality. Selene remained still, her breath shallow, listening. The battle was over, she had won. Malachar was gone, erased by the force of her power. And yet, something deep inside her whispered otherwise. Kael held her close, his warmth grounding her in the lingering cold of the void. It's over, he whispered, his fingers brushing her cheek. You did it. But Selene couldn't shake the weight pressing against her chest. The abyss wasn't just empty, it was waiting. A gust of icy wind swept through the ruins of the battlefield, carrying the faint echo of something distant. A whisper, neither word nor voice, but a presence that slithered through the air like a lingering shadow. Selene's skin prickled. Kael felt it too. He stiffened beside her, his amber eyes darkening as his gaze swept over the wreckage of the void. Something still here. Selene turned in slow circles, searching the abyss. The shadows no longer lunged, but they watched, shifting in the periphery of her vision. And then, from the remnants of Malachar's destruction, something moved. A shape, a phantom of darkness, shifting without a solid form. It didn't attack. It didn't lunge. It only stood there. Watching. Selene's pulse quickened. Who are you? She called. The entity did not speak, but the air around them vibrated with something ancient, something that pressed against the edges of her mind. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it whispered. He was never the true threat. Selene's breath hitched. Kael bared his fangs, stepping protectively in front of her. What do you mean? The figure did not answer. Instead, the abyss trembled beneath them, a deep, guttural resonance reverberating through the very fabric of the realm. The shadows stirred, not in attack, but in fear. Selene gritted her teeth. If Malachar wasn't the real danger, then who is? For the first time, the shifting darkness recoiled. And just before it vanished into the abyss once more, a single word echoed through the void, sending ice down her spine. The Forgotten One. And then, everything collapsed. The abyss shattered, unraveling like torn fabric, and the real world snapped back into place. Selene and Kael were thrown to the ground, gasping for breath as the cold of the abyss faded. The battlefield was gone. The ruins remained. But the world felt different, as though something had changed the moment they returned. Selene met Kael's gaze, the fear in her heart mirrored in his expression. The battle was over. But something far worse had just awakened. Chapter 30, The Forgotten One Awakens. The silence after the abyss had collapsed was deceptive. Selene stood at the center of the battlefield, Kael at her side, their breathing still uneven, their minds reeling from the warning that had come from the darkness itself. The Forgotten One. The name clung to her like a curse, like something that had been buried within her own bloodline, waiting. She turned, scanning the ruined landscape, searching for some clue to what that whispered warning had meant. But the battlefield was empty now, save for the fading remnants of Malachar's destruction. Yet, something was shifting, just beyond her senses. Kael gritted his teeth, his golden eyes still scanning the terrain. I don't like this, he muttered. That thing, whatever it was afraid. Selene's gaze flickered toward him. And if something from the abyss is afraid, what does that mean for us? Before he could answer, a shockwave of energy rippled through the air, strong enough to send them both stumbling. The earth beneath them cracked, glowing with deep, crimson veins of power. The sky overhead darkened, not the night, but something deeper, a presence stretching through reality itself. A whisper swept through the battlefield, layered with voices, not one, but many. It was ancient. Ragged with time, yet unbearably strong. You should not have severed the cycle. Selene's fingers clenched, her nails digging into her palm. Who are you? She called into the void. Silence, and then a laugh. Hollow, cold. It echoed, stretching from the very fabric of the shadows. I am what was forsaken. The ground shuddered violently, and from the cracks, tendrils of blackened mist began to rise. Kael moved in front of Selene instinctively, his claws elongating, his muscles tensing for a fight. But this was not like any enemy they had faced before. This was something old, something that should not have been awakened. I am what was forgotten. And now, you have made me remember. A figure began to take shape, rising from the mist, its form shifting between something humanoid and something utterly monstrous. A tall, emaciated silhouette with eyes like burning voids, its arms wrapped in the chains of 1,000 curses. It wore the remnants of a long-forgotten crown, and from its form echoed the voices of the dead. Selene's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary being. This was something from before the kingdoms, before the covens, before the bloodlines. Kael took a step back, his claws flexing. Selene, he said, voice low, warning. That thing is not a shadow. No. It wasn't. It was something worse. The Forgotten One had awakened. And now, the real war was about to begin. Chapter 31, The Forsaken King. Selene and Kael stood frozen, their breath shallow as the mist coiled around the towering figure before them. The Forgotten One. A being whose very existence had been erased from history, yet now stood before them, watching, waiting. Selene steadied herself. Who are you? She demanded, her voice firm despite the fear coiling in her chest. The entity shifted, its form solidifying into something more human, yet still utterly otherworldly. The chains that wrapped its arms rattled as it stepped forward, and the remnants of a shattered crown gleamed upon its brow. Its voice, when it spoke, was layered, like a chorus of souls whispering from the abyss. I was once Aurelian, king of the eternal court. I was the first ruler of the bloodborn, before the covens, before the kingdoms. Until I was betrayed. Selene's stomach twisted. Betrayed? Aurelian's hollow gaze flickered toward her. By my own kind. By those who feared what I had become. The mist thickened, and suddenly, memories not her own surged through Selene's mind. Visions of a grand empire, bathed in darkness, where vampires and creatures of shadow lived in a fragile harmony. But something changed. Aurelian's thirst for power grew insatiable. He sought to transcend mortality itself, to claim dominion not just over blood and shadow, but over fate itself. The ancient rulers, the ones who would one day become the first vampire lords, feared him. And so, they gathered their forces, wove a spell of unfathomable power, and cast him out of time itself, erasing his name, his legacy, his very existence. The world moved forward, forgetting that once, there had been a king greater than them all. Until now. Selene staggered, gasping as the visions faded. They buried you, she whispered. But you survived. Aurelian's lips curled into something resembling a smile. The void does not grant mercy. It reshapes. It waits. His burning gaze locked onto her. And now, because of you, I have returned. Kael growled low in his throat. And what do you want? Aurelian took another step forward, the ground trembling beneath his presence. What was stolen from me? Selene's blood ran cold. You want the throne. Aurelian tilted his head. I want what was mine. I want the bloodborne restored, not as broken factions, but as what we were meant to be. Eternal. Unchallenged. Rulers of the night. His gaze darkened. And I will burn this world to do it. The air crackled with dark energy, the ground splitting beneath them. The sky above twisted, shadows writhing like living things. Selene clenched her fists. She had faced war. She had faced monsters. But Aurelian was something else entirely. He was a forgotten god, rising once more. And now, she and Kael had to decide, do they fight him? Or do they run? Chapter 32, The Gathering Storm. Selene's mind raced as she and Kael stood before Aurelian, the air crackling with his raw, ancient power. The sky above them churned, the very fabric of reality shifting under his presence. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew, there was no running from a force like this. Kael's claws flexed, his stance lowering in a battle-ready form. "We can't let him take the throne," he murmured, just loud enough for Selene to hear. Aurelian smiled, as if he had heard every word. "Ah, the young ones always think they have a choice." Selene lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his glowing, abyssal gaze. "You want the throne? You'll have to take it through fire and blood." Aurelian's laughter echoed, dark and knowing. "Oh, child. That was always the plan." Before they could react, a shockwave of darkness erupted from his form, sending Selene and Kael hurtling backward. The air grew thick with an unnatural chill, and the ground beneath them trembled as the ruins began to shift. From the cracks in the earth, figures emerged, warriors from another time, clad in armor untouched by decay. Their empty eyes glowed with a haunting blue light, their weapons humming with a lost magic. Selene gasped. "No, these are..." Kael's eyes widened. "The fallen bloodborn. The ancient warriors, those who had once served Aurelian before his betrayal, had returned." Aurelian lifted a hand, his fingers twitching as if pulling strings. "I will not reclaim my empire alone," he said. "My kingdom shall rise, and my warriors shall bring ruin to all who oppose it." Selene's heart pounded. The covens, the werewolves, none of them were prepared for this. This wasn't just a war. This was the return of an empire lost to time. Kael snarled, stepping forward. "We stop him now." Aurelian smirked, extending his arms as the shadows twisted around him. "You are welcome to try." The first of the warriors lunged, and the battle for the future of the world began. The night had never felt darker, the fate of the world never more uncertain. Selene's grip tightened on her blades, and beside her, Kael let out a low, menacing growl. If this was the end, then they would make sure Aurelian bled before he took his throne. The shadows closed in. And then, everything erupted into chaos. Chapter 33, The Battle of Shadows. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The fallen bloodborn surged forward, their spectral armor clanking as they advanced, their weapons gleaming with an eerie blue glow. Shadows writhed beneath their feet, slithering like serpents, and the very air seemed to tremble at their presence. Selene raised her blades just as the first warrior struck. The impact sent a shudder through her arms, the sheer force of it nearly driving her to her knees. But she gritted her teeth and spun, her sword slicing through the ghostly figure's armor. Instead of blood, black mist hissed from the wound, swirling into the air like a living thing before reforming. "They don't die like normal creatures," she shouted to Kael as she dodged another strike. Kael roared, his claws slashing through the misty form of another bloodborn. The creature let out a hollow, distorted scream but barely faltered. "Then we'll just have to rip them apart until they stay dead." Aurelian watched from above, standing on a crumbling platform of stone, his tattered cloak billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. His eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "Fight all you wish," he called down to them. These warriors were bound by my command centuries ago. You cannot kill what has already been forsaken. Selene snarled, leaping over a crumbling archway and landing in a crouch, striking out at another soldier. But Aurelian's words rang true. The fallen warriors were relentless, reforming as quickly as they were struck down. She needed a new plan. A sudden pulse of energy rippled through the battlefield. A figure darted past her, too fast to follow, a blur of shadows and silver steel. Then another. More warriors had joined the fray. But these were not Aurelians. The Nightborn Legion had arrived. Vampires in obsidian armor, wielding enchanted blades, descended upon the battlefield. Their leader, Commander Vane, a vampire general of legend, slashed through the misty forms of the Bloodborne with practiced precision. Selene gasped. Vane? You're supposed to be dead, he interrupted, smirking. Not yet, princess. He parried an incoming strike. We heard about your little war and thought we'd even the odds. Kael's pack arrived moments later, massive werewolves crashing into the battlefield like a living storm. Claws met steel, magic clashed against shadow. The battle transformed into a storm of movement, a deadly dance between past and present. Selene spotted Aurelian watching from above. He had to be stopped. She turned to Kael. We have to take him down now. Kael met her gaze, his golden eyes burning. Together, they sprinted toward the ruins where Aurelian stood, cutting down any Bloodborne that tried to stop them. The air crackled as Aurelian raised his hands, summoning a dark wave of energy that split the sky in two. Selene leaped, blade glowing with the power of her ancestors. Kael followed, fangs bared, claws extended. Their final battle had begun. Chapter 34, Reckoning of the Damned. Selene and Kael soared toward Aurelian, the battlefield a storm of chaos below them. Shadows clashed with steel, the screams of the dying drowned beneath the roar of magic breaking reality itself. The ground trembled beneath the weight of forgotten power, cracks of dark energy spiraling outward like a curse reborn. Aurelian raised his arms, his tattered cloak billowing, his eyes aglow with abyssal might. You challenge what you cannot comprehend, he intoned, voice reverberating through the battlefield. I was born in darkness before your kind knew the taste of blood. I was death before you learned to fear it. Selene twisted midair, her blade flashing in the dying light, striking toward his chest. But before her weapon could connect, Aurelian vanished. In an instant, he materialized behind her, a clawed hand wreathed in black flame slashing downward. She barely deflected it, her arms burning from the sheer force of the impact. The recoil sent her crashing into the ruined archway below, stone crumbling beneath her weight. Kael lunged, shifting midair, claws elongating as he sought Aurelian's throat. The Forsaken King laughed, catching him mid-leap with an unseen force, slamming him into the ground so hard the earth splintered. Selene coughed, tasting blood. They were outmatched. But then, a familiar voice cut through the cacophony. Not today, monster. Commander Vane and the Nightborn Legion surged forward, enchanted weapons gleaming in defiance. At their side, Kael's pack howled into the fray, werewolves leaping toward the Bloodborne warriors with relentless fury. Aurelian turned his gaze upon them. You think numbers matter to me? He lifted his hand, and the dead obeyed. From the ruins, skeletal hands clawed from the earth, phantoms of long-forgotten warriors rising in endless ranks. The very land wept as his command echoed through time. Selene forced herself to stand. They could not fight him head-on. Aurelian was tied to something deeper than life itself. If they wanted to defeat him, they had to sever that connection. She turned to Kael, who wiped blood from his mouth, eyes still burning with fire. We need to break his tether to the abyss. Kael met her gaze, nodding. Then let's cut him loose. Selene focused inward, drawing upon the magic of her bloodline, calling forth the power that had long remained dormant. Ancient magic stirred within her, something older than war, older than the blood-born empire itself. The sky overhead shifted, a sigil forming in the heavens, the mark of the first coven. Aurelian paused. For the first time, his expression flickered, not with anger, but recognition. That magic. He whispered. You are. Selene didn't let him finish. She raised her blade, now glowing with radiant silver light, and launched herself forward. If Aurelian feared the power she carried, she would make him remember why. Kael roared, joining her charge, fangs bared, claws alight with power. Their final reckoning had begun. Chapter 35, The Final Hour. Selene and Kael struck in perfect synchrony, their attacks fueled by desperation and unyielding determination. Aurelian raised his arms, summoning a vortex of dark energy, but Selene was faster. Her silver blade, now pulsating with the ancient power of the First Coven, met his defense head-on. The impact shattered the air itself, sending ripples of force across the battlefield. The spectral warriors faltered for the first time, their glowing eyes flickering as if the very foundation of their existence was unraveling. Kael lunged at Aurelian's exposed side, his claws wreathed in fiery energy, a power drawn from the bond he shared with Selene. The strike tore through Aurelian's armor, black ichor spilling from the wound like liquid shadow. The Forsaken King let out a terrible roar, one that carried across time itself. The very ground quaked beneath them. You do not understand what you are doing. Aurelian snarled. His wounds began to mend, the abyss calling him back to life even as his strength wavered. Selene narrowed her eyes. We're ending this. She raised her blade high, whispering an incantation known only to the First Coven. The runes on her sword burned brighter, searing through the darkness, their glow banishing the remnants of Aurelian's tether to the abyss. Aurelian's eyes widened in realization. No. The sigil above them descended like a falling star, striking the Forsaken King directly in the chest. Aurelian screamed, his form distorting as his connection to the abyss was severed. The shadows that had once obeyed him fled, vanishing into the ether like mist before sunlight. The fallen blood-born warriors collapsed into dust. The dark magic sustaining them had been unmade. Aurelian staggered, his form shrinking, his might unraveling. You cannot kill me, he hissed, his voice fading. I will return. Selene took one last step forward, pressing the tip of her glowing sword against his chest. Not in this lifetime. She plunged the blade forward. Aurelian let out one final, soundless cry as his form dissolved, the remnants of his power scattering like ash in the wind. Silence fell over the battlefield. The war was over. Kael turned to Selene, his breath heavy, his golden eyes searching hers. Is it really done? Selene let out a slow exhale, looking toward the clear sky above, no longer tainted by darkness. Yes, she whispered. It is. But deep in her heart, she knew, true peace was never without a cost. And the price of their victory had yet to be revealed. Epilogue, Beyond the Shadows. The battlefield lay quiet beneath a silver moon, its scars etched deep into the earth as a testament to the violence endured. Selene stood at its center, Kael beside her, their hands intertwined as the wind whispered through the broken ruins. We did it, Kael murmured softly, breaking the silence. His voice, usually strong, held a gentle uncertainty. Selene's eyes glistened, reflecting the pale moonlight. Yes, we won. But at what cost? Her voice was barely above a whisper, laden with the weight of all they had lost. Kael cupped her face gently, turning her gaze to meet his own. We saved our people. We gave them hope. That has to count for something. Her lips curved into a bittersweet smile. Hope, she echoed softly. such a fragile thing. In the distance, survivors gathered, the Nightborn Legion and Kael's pack among them, working side by side for the first time in centuries. The war had ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. Peace won't come easily, Selene said, looking back to the gathering crowd. But we owe it to those who fell, to make it last. Kael tightened his grip on her hand, his golden eyes fierce and resolute. And we will. Selene took a deep breath, feeling the power of her ancestors flowing quietly through her veins. Her gaze turned toward the horizon, where dawn was breaking, its golden hues chasing away the lingering shadows. The prophecy spoke of destruction or salvation, she whispered, stepping forward with Kael at her side. Maybe it was never about fate choosing us. Maybe it was always about us choosing each other. Kael smiled softly, nodding as dawn painted the sky in vibrant shades of gold and crimson. Together, they stepped forward into the future, a future built not on bloodshed and shadows, but on hope and unity. Their love had defied destiny. Their bond had broken curses. And though darkness might return someday, they knew one truth would forever remain. Love was stronger than blood. The end.
Every story has an ending, but some mysteries live on. If you enjoyed this tale, don't let it fade into the shadows. Smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will transport you beyond the veil of the ordinary. Subscribe to our channel and your name will appear at the beginning of our next video, where we will pleasantly thank you for your subscribing. Tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. What twists did you see coming? And what secrets do you think still remain? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and let the next story begin.